So I start with a question. So we're talking about young learners for this webinar between 6 and 10. So let's start by describing them. This is a question for you teachers. What are the characteristics of young learners? How do they learn? What do you think?
Great, everyone. Let us know what you think. What are the characteristics of young learners and how would you say that they learn? Let's see. Hawaii says by imitation and memorization. What else? What other characteristics of young learners would you take into consideration when teaching them in your class? Let's see. Louise says they like to play a lot. They listen and watch. Noreen says curiosity is a characteristic. They learn by games from Norma. Let's see, visualization, and they're very active from Lydia.
Wow, I don't think I even need to teach today. If you go to the next slide, basically everything you just said is there. So here's what I came up with. Like you said, they like to imitate. In fact, when I do games and songs and I have to scratch my nose, they sometimes scratch their nose as well. They aim to please. They really want to please you. It's not about their peers just yet. It's about you. So use that. As you mentioned, they are energetic, spontaneous, and curious. And I hope you are too, to deal with that. They're egocentric, which at this age is not a negative term. That means they process everything from their point of view. So we start with things with the body before we move out into other things. They have limited attention spans. Sometimes this is seen as negative, but I think it just, if we know that, we can change up our activities and dynamics. They love predictability. So routines and repetition are not boring for them. So we also use that to our advantage. Because they're so young, they have partial knowledge of the world, of course, and of their own mother tongue. And also, of course, of their second language, their first language and second language. So we have to keep that in mind. They learn through social interaction. So they're very much a part of the group. They like choral response. They like to feel safe and have lots of interaction with the teacher. And this last point, we'll talk more in depth, but they see language globally as a whole. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about that point more in depth. But I want to know what you think first. I took this phrase from a book that I really love by Lynn Cameron called Teaching Languages to Young Learners. She said children are inside language. So looking at that last point that children see language as a whole and children are inside language, dear teachers here today, what do you think that phrase means?
Great question. So we see this quote here, children are inside the language. What do you think that means? And do you agree or disagree? Or what are your thoughts on this quote?
Right.
Let's see. Hawaii says that young learners practice language with their bodies. Great point. Irene says they are born to learn. Great. What other ideas do you have? Let's see. Atif says they like to play with the language. So great thought. Great. What other ideas do you have about children being inside the language? I guess I sort of think of it as they are interacting with it and they are a part of it, and they're not thinking of it as something outside of them. They're just right there with it.
Okay, you know me. Right. So we tend to approach our classes, and when we think of grammar from our perspective, we're teachers, we're grammar nerds, we love that. Whereas listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and we have to know that. That's our craft. But if we're going to be learning-centered, not learner-centered, we must take it from their perspective. They just want to play the game. They're waiting. Okay, teacher, just give me something that I can do. But because the language is such a universe, we need to scaffold or support the children for their active participation in the activities. So we're going to talk about that on the next slide. Thank you. So scaffolding, this is a key concept for this webinar. So they can participate, we need to provide just enough, that's the key words, just enough support so that students can complete a task or goal successfully. We know that when we teach our children to ride a bike, we have training wheels where we hold their hand, we step further and further back. But what does this mean for the classroom? Just enough support. Well, here's some examples you can see. And on the next slide, I'll give you a little more in depth. Okay, so on the next slide, we talk about chunks. So we scaffold, we give them a phrase to say so they can participate. For example, in a game we're going to play later, we'll say, is it blue? So everybody will have that bit, their line to participate. We can
so
also,
in this case, the chunk is it? Oh, okay, yeah. Cool. Just one little piece of language, but maybe more than one word.
Little tiny piece, yes. And we're going to talk about that much more in depth, but this is the way we can help their active oral participation in our activities and tasks. Choral response, so they can say, is it blue altogether? 1, 2, 3, class, is it blue? So we don't leave any children behind or guessing. We want everyone to be successful and supported. We can use gestures, facial expressions. For example, is it blue? We could point to something blue. If we're talking about prepositions, we're going to do a chant later. I can just show you the preposition without saying it so I can support your active participation. Routine. Play the game in the same way, the same order, especially at the beginning, so the children know what to expect and they can focus on the language. That's another way. Also, repetition. Sometimes teachers say, oh, Wendy, the kids get bored. I don't want to do the same thing every day. You know how kids are with stories and movies. They want to do the same thing. They're excited. But we don't just do exactly the same thing. We change it up. We give a new word every day. A new child gets to participate. So these are just 5 examples of scaffolding, and we'll want to do that especially early on.
Great. Yeah, we have a nice comment from Mahmoudal who says, scaffolding is important because it facilitates the cognitive process. Great comment. Thank you. And a couple of other comments from participants related to the concept that you had for us about children being inside the language, which I thought were really interesting, and I didn't quite see them early enough. Let's see. Mikhail says they don't analyze the language logically, but they from the outside like we do. They're inside. And Elena says they feel it and they don't care too much about grammar rules. So great comments. Thanks, everybody.
These are my people. Love you. Great. Okay, let's go to the next slide because I have a question for you. So this gets at the